Meyer, and uh, first to let you know that this meeting is being recorded, so that if you wish not to be present on the recording, you may take your picture off by closing your video. You will be muted throughout the program. Lena is our technical support, and if you have any difficulties, you may contact her through chat. The only people who will receive chat are Lena and the hosts. We keep people muted and use the chat for means of asking questions and providing comments in support of our presenters this evening, so that they're not interrupted in the course of their presentation by trying to maintain a focus on their presentation and also on what's coming through chat. Lena will be taking the questions, perhaps consolidating some of them, and then raising those at the end of the program. I'd like to thank both Pendle Hill and Decolonizing Quakers for supporting these ongoing webinars and lectures and inquiries towards right relationship with Indigenous peoples. As many of you participated in last summer and fall's series of 6 webinars, this is the first in a series that will follow. Tonight's program is on land acknowledgement. And before we go any further, let me make a point. Several people have raised comments prior to or questions before this evening's program about land acknowledgements. This is not a perfunctory or performative exercise to make Quakers feel good about themselves. It is rather a first step towards right relationship with the people whose land we currently occupy, worshiping on it, working on it, living on it, recognizing that regardless of whether it was paid for or simply stolen or through broken treaties, it nonetheless was shepherded and belonged to the people who belonged to the earth. And establishing right relationship with them involves us establishing as white settler colonialists, if that is who we are, with both the people and the land. So regard this as a first step to be followed by other substantive actions. To wit, we know that this evening, New England Yearly Meeting is struggling itself with the question of further steps to be taken in both acknowledgement and repair of Quaker involvement, both individually and corporately, the support of Indigenous boarding schools, which other people might refer to as re-education camps. So let us be mindful that this is a single step in a process. I would like, before we go any further this evening, I better first apologize. I'm having a lot of difficulty with my computer, and I'm told that my voice is breaking up. So if you are experiencing audio difficulties, it's not with your computer, but with mine. I would like to
We're with you, John.
Pendle Hill is situated in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people for at least 12,000 years before European contact. Lenape means the original people, and they are respected as the grandfathers by other Native Americans in the Algonquin language family. Before contact, early in the 17th century, Before contact, early in the 17th century, the Lenape people lived in numerous small, loosely affiliated communities along the watersheds of the Hudson, Lehigh, and Delaware rivers, embracing all of what is now New Jersey, Delaware, and eastern Pennsylvania, and parts of New York. Within the first 100 years of contact, violence and disease killed an estimated 80% of that population. And as European colonists settled this area in greater numbers, most of the Lenape, now more commonly known as the Delaware, were pushed west, first into areas of western Pennsylvania, then into the Ohio River Valley and Canada. Later Indian removals scattered different elements of the Lenape into Idaho, Wisconsin, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Some Lenape people stayed behind in Lenape-Hoking, as they say, hidden in plain sight. Today, there are 3 state-recognized Lenape tribal nations within the original Lenape-Hoking. The Nanticoke Lenape Nation near Bridgeton, New Jersey, the Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware in Cheswold, Delaware, and the Ramapo Lenape Nation near Mahwah, New Jersey. Pendle Hill is seeking deeper relationship with these nations through their tribal leaders. Now I would like to introduce tonight's speakers. Tom Punish, who will be leading the webinar this evening, is one of 12 siblings born to a Standing Rock Lakota tribal member mom and a white lawyer dad, and grew up good and Catholic, as he says, in Minnesota on what had been Dakota and Anishinaabe contested land. He joined the Navy for adventure and the GI Bill, became a linguist, served in the Persian Gulf, Indian Ocean, and Spain, and studied religion. He works today at being a dad, protecting and educating about indigenous sites in Tennessee, attends Nashville Friends Meeting, and hangs out at the intersection of religion, decolonization, atheism, and quiet. Quite an intersection. We are also pleased and honored to have with us Chief Dennis Coker, who is and has been the principal elected chief of Lenape Tribal Nation of Delaware for the past 25 years. He has been a great friend to Pendle Hill and has worked closely with so many different organizations, including Haverford College, the University of Delaware, and has led his tribal nation in preserving the Chesapeake Bay and the Delaware River watershed, and served on multiple commissions, both at the federal level and at the state level, and worked so hard to obtain state recognition from the state of Delaware to be a tribal nation recognized by Delaware and also recognized as a census group by the federal government. We're also pleased to have with us this evening Nia To Go There, PhD. Nia grew up on Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota, her father's reservation. Her mother's reservation is Rocky Boy, Montana. Her tribal ancestry is Cree. Her spiritual quest has led her back to her ancestral roots that profile her efforts and advocacy for our living planet. This evening, we will first invite Tom to present his webinar. And then, because Tom is in a particular location, and although his words of wisdom about seeking truth about the land on which we live and work and worship is applicable in all states. He comes from a particular geographical location and lives in a particular geographical location, which, as you probably know if you've done any work in this area, depends a great deal on how one goes about establishing relationship with the tribal nations from whom the land was taken. As indicated in our opening acknowledgement of Lenape Hoking, many of the tribal nations of Lenni Lenape were removed from the land, either voluntarily or by force. So the Eastern Coast has a different set of circumstances than one might find in the Middle West, where many of those tribal nations were removed to on their way to some reservation in Oklahoma or Missouri or Kansas. And those who live in the further West have a different circumstance also. So we have invited Chief Coker and Nia to offer their perspective on the webinars before we entertain questions and answers. Our intention is that Tom will speak for about 50 minutes, that we will have about 10 minutes of response from each of the two respondents. And then we will entertain questions from the individual participants. And remember that this is part one of a two-part series, and we will be meeting again on Thursday evening, 7:30 to 9 p.m. Eastern time, so that if we do not get to your question this evening, it doesn't mean that it won't be answered. It means that we will take it under consideration, offer it to our speaker and respondents, and have an opportunity perhaps to respond to those questions tomorrow. So with that, I would invite friends to sink down into a seeking place with open heart and mind, out of which silence Tom will begin his talk this evening. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Lena. Uh, Good to see you, Dennis and Nia again. Uh, it's great to be here, uh, shooting through Philadelphia electronically to talk about this kind of stuff, which I'd like to, since I'm a genealogist and since I like family relationships, and really what we're talking about is the genealogy of the land, the relationship between the land and the people who lived there. And so this would be an alternative title is who land and water used to live with and where, who married the land, kind of an interspecies genealogy of land before the European trophic cascade changed it all. Uh, I'm using two computers tonight, just to let you know why I'm looking over here sometimes, and I'm should be focused right here on you, and I see the stuff right in front of me, but just be advised. And also, uh, John's scratchy connection, and I have a thunderstorm coming through here. As John said, I'm from Minnesota. This little map here depicts where we first encountered my great grandmother down Lakota along the Missouri River and up the Missouri River as the family moved to settle in at Fort Yates at Standing Rock in 1878. And then where my grandpa was born is the farthest northwest point up at Fort Berthold, which is now 3 affiliated tribes. And then my great grandma moved the family down that red path down to St. Paul, Minnesota, which is another story of how and why that happened. But I grew up in that darker red spot just northwest of there on the Mississippi River, and it was a contested land. It was first Dakota, and as we'll see on some maps I have, and then the Anishinaabe came in over the lake and under the lake and pushed the Dakota out and took over all of that area. And then in 1841, they even put Ho Chunk there on the land where we grew up. I grew up on a former reservation. But and this is my favorite picture of Turtle Island. I think it's a best image I have ever seen of a turtle carrying the earth on its back. By the way, this goes back and forth sometimes, so I apologize. I want to start out being sensitive about some words we use, and sometimes I'm insensitive about words that people like or don't like. Um, Nia and I have talked, Dennis and I have talked, John and I have talked, and we don't all agree on vocabulary, but just to let you know that when you hear something that you don't like, if any words you find offensive, please say ouch in the chat. Send it on to Lena. Uh, Oops is when you've maybe misspoke, used a word that somebody else doesn't like, and you catch yourself. And woe is when uh, somebody else has done something that you feel ought to be noticed. Somebody you may feel for somebody. So that's ouch, oops, and whoa. Hope you've encountered those before. But put those in the chat. Most people don't know about the word caconym, really good English word. It means bad words, as you know, well, comes from caca. I want to reaffirm tonight that Indians are from India. People who live here, who were here 500, 600 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, are not Indians. Native people are not. Indigenous people are not. We can use the word native, indigenous, it doesn't matter. I just want to point out that Indians are from India, and I applaud the effort of the yearly meetings to change their names and people's references from Indian to the national name, the indigenous name of tribal peoples of where they're from. The next one is that I really dislike the word Sioux. It comes from the Anishinaabe, on the south side of Lake Michigan when the Jesuits and fur traders were coming through, and they were asking, who are those people to the west? And the people there said, those are the Little Snakes people, and that's Nadawisu, and the contraction into Sioux. And so it's what we in linguistics is called an exonym. It's a name for outsiders, made by outsiders for another group, and it's simply wrong. Like Indians, uh, Sioux is a wrong word. My family calls itself Lakota. They also call themselves Sioux, and I'm not here to judge who's supposed to use what when. Uh, but I prefer the term Dakota for the tribes in Minnesota and Lakota for the tribes in and around North and South Dakota. I want to remind everybody that this land was not called America 500 years ago. That America is a European experiment of exporting people and colonizing foreign land and settling and occupying it. And that we call, in the absence of any other better name, Turtle Island. So I'm going to use that distinction tonight when I talk about America or the United States, as many of my Spanish-speaking friends make sure. We are in the United States and Canada, and that, anyway, America is the wrong word, except for the European experiment. I hope everybody uses Turtle Island when we're talking about indigenous peoples. And the last one is Hispanic and Latino, which as European words mean Spanish and Roman. And for the life of me, I still don't understand how that happened, but calling Native people, indigenous people, and I think that's what we're trying to get to when we talk Hispanic and Latin people. We're talking about mixed bloods like myself, who have Native and probably some white blood in there, that the proper term is to call them indigenous or from Abya Yala. But that term is problematic. That's all I want to say about that. Before we start, we're going to get into some of the whys at the end, and especially on Thursday, but I was hoping that you would all have a piece of paper next to you and write down these questions and answer them over the course of the next half hour. Why land acknowledgements? Why should we do this? Why should any meeting do this? Any church, any business, any organization? And why should we do it now? I'm sure that all of you are here with some kind of motivation to do so, either to say it's good and we should do it, or to say it's bad and that we shouldn't do it. So I'm wondering, towards the end we'll get into this, why do you think we should do or not do land acknowledgements, and why now? And lastly, that question on the bottom is very, very important. Who benefits from land acknowledgements? Ooh, there we go. Mato is bear in Lakota, and Medewakan is lake mystery, sacred, holy, sacred lake, and it's a story I'm going to tell. So this is the land where I grew up. I didn't know all of this at all when I was young. I lived in that little red dot north of St. Cloud on the Mississippi River, and oftentimes we would go up to that bigger red dot, which is the land of, which is Medewakan, otherwise known as Mille Lacs Lake. It's the biggest lake we ever saw. There are points where we could not see across the lake. It is that big. Of course, all of you who live next to oceans think, well, that's nothing. But in Minnesota, it was very impressive. And we went up here to the reservation, and that's when I learned that these people were not our people. These were the enemies of Dakota Lakota people, and they're the ones who pushed the Dakota out from this area. This lake here is the homeland of Dakota and Lakota people. It's called Medewakan. Now it's called Mille Lacs. And the Anishinaabe people successfully pushed. I'll go back. Let me see. There we go. So you can see how the Anishinaabe were on the northeast, and to the east. And as they were being pushed themselves, that's why they pushed themselves into Dakota land, fought, and took that from the Dakota. Now it's owned by the Mille Lacs Band of Chippewa, Ojibwe, otherwise known as Anishinaabe. And that big red dot is where, back in the late 1980s, the Mille Lacs Band of Chippewa wanted to put an adult senior center. So being the good caretakers of the land, or whatever you want to call it, they called in surveyors, and they also called in archaeologists to make sure that this was a clean spot, or an okay spot to put it. They didn't want to hit any burials. Well, they cleared it. The top, they started digging, and they encountered a bear skull. Now, a bear skull up in Mille Lacs is not that unusual. What is unusual is that it was all by itself, and that there was nothing else directly connected to it. So it was placed there, and they started digging around, and they found more. They found 2, 3, 4, and they found over 400 bear skulls in a ring underground. And the Anishinaabe did something that I think is remarkable, given the history between Dakota and Anishinaabe people. And that is, they said, this is not ours. This is from somebody who lived here beforehand. We need to contact those people. And they did. They called them up and said, hey, it's all written down. This is in an archaeological journal, and one of my younger brothers is an archaeologist, and he told me parts of this story. They called up the Dakota down in Prairie Island, Shakopee, and Upper and Lower Dakota reservations, and they said, come see and tell us what to do. They said, this is not ours. This is yours. Please tell us. So this is the most remarkable land acknowledgement that I have ever heard of, and it's intertribal. I'm checking my screen here. Whoops, there we go. That site is called Shabushkung Bay at Mille Lacs Lake. You can look it up. And we're talking, the Dakota were there, the Anishinaabe came, and the Anishinaabe now own that old Dakota land, and they said, we know it's you. What do you want us to do? And it was just great respect shown between the tribes, which I think is what is the model for everything that anybody could do in the future. Is you find out, you ask, and then you meet and say, what can we do to help? Tonight, I'm going to talk about step 1 out of 8 steps. On Thursday, I'll go through the next 7 steps. But tonight, I want to talk about how and a little bit about why. Mostly we'll cover why on Thursday. So get ready. This is step 1 in a nutshell. You can, by the way, you can screenshot this, write it down. You choose a land area. I'm sure that all of us, I see people here from California, from Colorado, from Montana, Canada, Ottawa. So where you want to do a land acknowledgement, you find out what it is, where the specific land is, and then you start researching and collecting histories. A very simple, very basic thing to do is in any genealogy, you'll find the location and who was there. And that's what step 2 is doing. The third one is writing a history of what you find out about who was there, when they were there, and what laws affected, what treaties affected them, the people on there, if people were moved, where they were removed to. And then once you have that written, you have to connect and confirm it with a First Nation, with somebody. We don't, there should be nothing about us without us. There should be nothing about you without your knowledge, without your participation. And it's just basic respect. One of the best ways that you can find out who was there, we get this question in Tennessee, which is where I'm calling from. By the way, I should tell you that I'm here on the eastern suburbs of Nashville. I used to live in Chattanooga for 30 years, and a couple of years ago, my wife and I and kids moved up here for her job, and now we live on the east side of Nashville, and all of the land acknowledgments in and around Nashville say two tribes were here: the Shawnee and the Cherokee. That's it. You can go to Frisk Museum, you can go to Vanderbilt University, you can go to any place, and that's what they will say. If we go to nativeland.ca, which is Canada, we can see that they use 3 different categories that they have researched to place people in. Who was there physically, the language groups that they belong to, and the treaties that affected them. It's a beautiful site. If people had done that here, they would have seen that the Shawnee never lived here, that all of the history, the mounds that are here, the burials that are here, predate Cherokee and Shawnee presence here in the 18th century, and that they were Yuchi and Muskogee people. You know, the conversation that George Washington was having with Benjamin Franklin was saying, why do the Muskogee Creek keep attacking Nashville? And then all the stone box burials point directly to the Yuchi. So there are different ways that you have to broaden your perspective on who has the information and not trust anything right away. So we'll look at, oops, here we go. So I'm just using Tennessee as an example. You can go right there to native-land.ca right now, look up Ohio, Arizona, Florida, and see what it says. But here, let me see if this will do it. There. It says Chickasaw, it says Shawnee, it says Cherokee, and they don't even have Yuchi on this map. But this is tribal territories of what were claimed. And the Cherokee said, well, a friend of mine who claims to be Cherokee says, Tom, I never said that we owned that land or that land was ours. I just said that we were good real estate agents. So, I can't hear you guys chuckling, but it makes me. Here is tribal languages, and being a linguist, I'm mostly impressed by language maps because they tell us language groups, who's related to who, the genealogy. And here again, oops. There. Here we see Shawnee were moving south from Ohio. We see that the Cherokee were actually in the valley of the Tennessee River. And here we finally do see Yuchi and Quasadi and Chickasaw, which are Muskogean language groups. So and here's the word Muskogee down further. And so this was essentially a 19th century, 20th century map of where people were, or people thought they were, or the people that were encountered. The Shawnee had nowhere near the size or presence of that pink shape here in Kentucky or Tennessee. They were spread out, and there are no archaeological sites because they were so new. They were being pushed off from the migrations. And so that's tribal languages. And then the other part that you need to look into is the tribal treaties. What, uh, who treated with whom for which land? And there are much better maps than this, but this is a great beginning. And you have to find out, there's no Nashville here. There's no Lexington or Atlanta here. You have to know your map and figure it out. Actually, all you have to do is type in your city name, your rural, whatever town name, and it will take you right there. So these are the treaties that you have to find out, and we'll find out, or we found out, that all of the treaties that sold this Muskogee and Yuchi land were treaties with the Cherokee. They said it was their tribal, they were the ones to the east. They encountered the whites coming in from the ocean, from the shores, crossing the territory, and then they got to the Cherokee and they said, "Who's that?" Or "How far does your land go?" And they say, "Well, we own, hundreds of miles this way." Notice all the white space, all the non-ceded space on that side, on the East Coast side. The next tool that you can use that I really like is wikipedia.org's map of indigenous languages of the Americas. It essentially uses an non-copyrighted abstracted form of another map I'll show you just below this. This is really clear, really easy to understand, except of course for down by New Orleans and California. But see this area called 2? And it's linked up here, over here to Yuchi. Most people have never heard of the Yuchi tribe. The last town of the Yuchi was destroyed by the Cherokee in 1714 over off the Tennessee River. And they were then subsumed and became part of the Muskogee Creek Nation. And so that's why it's here. And then you say, well, if that happened in 1714, how can, and they were subsumed into this green area of the Muskogee Creek Nation, why is it standing there all by itself? What about these other linguistic isolates? This is a first contact map based off of Yves Goddard. You can see his name up there in the top left. What happened is that if you look down at California, you see that gray. Hernando de Soto in 1540 came through here, touched these areas here, and then crossed across here to the Mississippi River, where he was killed and died. So that's how we know a lot of this history, and that's the first contact, first white contact, first European contact that natives had in the Southeast. So you can look, you can go get this map yourself, and it's beautiful. This is a blow up of the area where I'm at. I'm at Yuchi Land 2. And you'll notice the word up there, vacant quarter. Do you see that? All that area, no contact. There was no recorded first contact language in there. I'll get into that. The third resource to use, or that I would recommend, some of you may be in an area where you don't need to know this stuff, but it happened that I was down, let me see, yes. This is the larger map of Yves Goddard that did for the Smithsonian. It's purchasable through the University of Nebraska for $25. Beautiful map. And if you send me a question, I can always figure out, I can always blow up a part of where you're at. But this is where I'm at. And I made the outline of Tennessee a little bit darker. What's important to note is to figure out is who were the first contact people, who were the first Europeans that made contact and who were the first native tribes that were contacted, and how did people know who those people were, like the Catawba. We have in fact, I think all of the Catawban speakers are now dead. So that's a lost language. But we know that words were written down by Soto's scribes, and that's one of the reasons we know that the Catawba were there. The Cherokee still survive. The Katua band still speaks Tsalagi in their council meetings, and the Muskogean languages survive. Yuchi is still survives. So we have those words in Soto's manuscripts, and because the people still survive. But see that white area again? I'm going to be talking about that now because I hope that some of you live there. And that's a real problem because that showed no native contact, no first contact, no natives living there that they could speak with in that whole, I'll go back to that, all that area. Look at that. Georgia, coast of Georgia, South Carolina, almost all of Kentucky. So all the contacts that we know of Shawnee in Kentucky were, after the fact that, after I think Tippecanoe and Tyler too, that battle with the Shawnee. West Virginia, Indiana, lots of Illinois. Empty. And this is the story of 5 removals. I presume that most of you don't live in these areas, but I think it's important to know that at the first time of initial contact in 1492 in the islands of what's now called Hispaniola and Dominican Republic, that the disease started to spread, and then 300 years, in 1776, Dragging Canoe, Cherokee, moved from his upper village down to Chattanooga, and he had pockmarks on his face. That was 1776. He was an adult. So from 1540, from the time that Soto was walking around here in the southeast, all the way up through the 1700s, people were suffering from 300 years of smallpox, flu, typhoid, you name it, we got it. And it killed, I don't have it on here, but I think you all are probably familiar with the word decimate, which means to kill 1/10. It's a pretty poor word to use for what happened to indigenous people here because over 90% were killed. So that would be nonagecimate would be the correct word to use for the 90% that were killed. From that contact point of the East Coast began a refugee movement of people moving from East Coast inland and then farther to the west to get away from white settlers, white colonialists. That began the Great Migration and the diaspora, the removal of many people from their territory. The third was a racial cleansing that the United States sponsored, and Canada, but we'll talk about the USA since I'm here and I don't want to offend any Canadians. Manifest destiny, the Christian belief that this land was our land and that we were an exceptional people. It's a gift, and they started removing people. It was Thomas Jefferson's idea that all natives should be removed from east of the Mississippi. That was late 1700s he had that idea, and in 1838 or the 1820s it began, and in 1838 was the last removal of the Cherokee from Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and forced removal. It was one of the nicest removals, by the way. The Trail of Tears was much, much harder earlier on the Muskogee people as they were marched out in chains. The fourth removal was the assimilation schools, the so-called boarding schools, in which they forced Native kids to speak English, learn math, English, reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and to be American, all with the goal of erasing the identity and leaving only Americans in this great melting pot. The fifth removal has been the removal of artifacts from, well, here's a good question. Where is the closest Native American site that has something for you to see close to you? Is there one? Where I grew up, we had what was called the Indian Trail. That wasn't much. We couldn't be quite sure when or where it was or how it was made, but there were no mounds. Here in Nashville area, almost, well, 90% of the mounds have been completely destroyed. In the city, all of them have been destroyed. There are some sites that they said, oh, this used to be a mound. And just last week, I went to a still existing Mississippian mound, essentially a 13th, 14th century mound close to the city. But all the ones inside the city have been destroyed, bulldozed down. And the burials, over 6,000 burials in stone boxes of the Yuchi in downtown Nashville, all dug up and thrown away. That was the erasure of the land so that nobody could ever tell the history again. That's the 5 removals if you want to take a screenshot of that. But it's important to note that there are some areas on this continent that have no known Native history except for the artifacts that are there, the mounds, and that people have been digging and robbing them for the past 500 years. Have you all filled out your forms? No, that's okay. This isn't a workshop, actually. This is just a land acknowledgement thing, but work on it some more. We'll come back maybe tomorrow or when I do this on Zoom, I lose all of my clocks. So I'm getting towards the end. We are here because somebody acknowledged that Quakers are colonizers. This is from an article, webpage in 2018, and I believe Decolonizing Quakers was formed in 2017 around the same time, 2018. Is that correct, John? Thereabouts?
2018.
2018? Same time. And this, of course, is the great picture of William Penn explaining to Native Americans that he owns this property now and that he wants to live in peace with the people who live there. We'll get into more of this. I wanted to leave some time for Dennis and for Nia to comment on some of the stuff I said, but here are 2 pages of resources that you can use. I won't read them out, but you can take a screenshot, and we can also, I'll make a PDF for you. So on Thursday, you'll have a PDF to take home with you or print out, download, of all these interesting sites. And of course, readings on decolonizing, which is what we'll talk about, the connection between land acknowledgement and decolonizing on Thursday. I ran through that pretty quickly. I hope I didn't lose anybody. Dennis, you were here first. Would you have any comments you would like to make?
Sure, Tom, real quickly. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that the place from where I speak is the traditional unceded homeland of the Sicanese people of the Unalastico clan of the much larger Lenape diaspora. So that area is here in Delaware. The Sicanese were first contacted by the Dutch back in, I don't know, 1640, something like that. So, but Tom, I must say, you did an excellent job of describing the first steps, so land acknowledgements. I couldn't have done it better, absolutely. But many of the points that you bring up are my comments when I'm asked to consult on a land acknowledgement. And that first question, why land acknowledgements, is so important, because if you're striving to create a land acknowledgement, then I think it's prudent that you really do some soul searching and determine why. What's the goal for your land acknowledgement? And in addition, I would suggest that some action items be developed to accompany that acknowledgement. I know, I don't know, a couple of months ago, I received a phone call from a lady in New York City who her faith-based organization was preparing to create a land acknowledgement. So she called me up and she goes, "Chief Coker, I need to talk to you." So I called her back, and lo and behold, she said to me, she goes, "These land acknowledgements, are they just a bunch of words, a bunch of empty words, or are there action items that accompany them?" And I thought to myself, and she was actually the first person to ever bring that to my attention. It probably happened a year or so ago. But I think it's very important that those action items be a part of your acknowledgement. And I do agree with Tom, that big white area that was on his maps. It's very difficult to find, the histories of the people that that lived there before the Europeans arrived. That smallpox was a terrible, terrible pandemic. We have documented 16 smallpox or 6 smallpox epidemics that took place on the Delaware Bay between 1600 and 1700. With every outbreak, you would lose 50% of your community. And who are the vulnerable people to smallpox? It's the elders and the young. So with every outbreak, we would lose 50% of our wisdom keepers, our storytellers, our teachers, and then we'd lose half of our next generation. So by the time 1700 came about, that, would you call it, nona quesamate, 90% depopulation. And, so with that, and in many cases, through our traders that were making contact on the coast and then moving inland to trade their goods, they were spreading smallpox, and the villages were gone long before the Europeans ever arrived, just because it happened that quickly. So, my advice would be to contact your SHPOs, your state historic preservation offices. That agency or those agencies in all of our states They have done a lot of research, and they've done a lot of reviewed a lot of studies, archaeological studies, anthropological studies, and they have a good idea who may have been there prior to contact. And you know, those treaties that Tom mentioned, they don't exist in the East. You know, my particular community never signed a treaty. You know, that Treaty of Greenville that was up there in the right-hand corner, I believe, was the first treaty that the Lenape entered into, and they were already in Western Pennsylvania and Ohio by 1740. So, you know, those that were east of there were not represented in those treaties. So, you know, it's a tragic story. And, you know, I firmly believe that in order to promote healing in our cultures, that we need to get that baggage. We need to stop carrying it around and get it up on the table. And let's talk about that history. Let's own our share of that history. And then we can move forward from that point. That's why I'm really enthusiastic when people ask me to talk to them about land acknowledgements. I never say no. And it's, you know, and it can be difficult, that history, number one. And, you know, what is it that you intend to do with your land acknowledgement? You know, you got to kind of decide that as well. Some land acknowledgements are 4 pages long, you know, they really embellish the history or talk about the history. Then as a working, functional tool to open meetings and to conduct, you know, sessions, Zoom calls, they may pare it down to a couple of paragraphs. So, you know, for instance, I've been working with the University of Delaware on their land acknowledgement, and they've done a really, really good job. They're a land grant school. So they received money back in the 1880s from the sale of Indian lands west of the Mississippi. Their particular monies came from Indian lands in California. They were able to determine that, but that institution was built on and seeded, the seed money for it was supplied by the sale of Indian lands. So they had a particular, you know, motive for this land acknowledgement. And they are working on their action items. You know, the administration there is a little apprehensive at first, but you know, their action items are being considered, such as, you know, scholarships for Nanticoke and Lenape students, you know, technical advice for consultations that we find ourselves entering into. And another one would be providing contracts for Native businesses. You know, these universities do a lot of business, you know, maintenance businesses. And so, I mean, those are just a couple of examples where that action item piece can go. So I'll leave it at that. I really appreciate the interest in this session. It looks like it's great. And, you know, I applaud Pendle Hill for taking this step. I know I've talked with John a little while now about this process, and it seems like it's getting on its way. So that's a good thing. So thank you so much, Tom. You did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Nia? You're muted.
Good evening, everybody. I'll greet you in Cree at first. when we greet you, we're actually asking your state of being. We say, Tansikia. And you would answer, Aku shikia bitkia maka. I'm cool. How about you? And it's sort of feeling where you are and who you are. And I enjoyed both of your presentations. Tom, I enjoyed the geographical, actually going into the detail of the geography and how the languages actually came from the land. And then Dennis, it's good to hear you and then to meet you for the first time. In terms of land acknowledgement, I am on the home of my ancestors, the Cree people. And currently I'm actually on the Crow territory. The Crow people live about 40 miles east of where I am physically right now. I wanted to take more of a philosophical approach in talking about land acknowledgement. And I love your question there, Tom. Why land acknowledgements, why and who benefits? Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. When we use the phrase land acknowledgement, it's a recognition that the indigenous peoples lived a very ancient story of place, where they saw themselves as integral to the landscape. Their sense of identity came from the living earth. All of the creation stories that you will encounter actually metaphorically describe this. We have the emergent stories coming up from the living earth that we see in the Southwestern tribes, the Diné and the Pueblo and the Apache. And then we have the story of Turtle Island, where Sky Woman comes down, lands on the back of a turtle, and then the animals help her find some heart of earth so that she can expand that. And so we say we're on Turtle Island. We're on this living entity, this living being. And so these stories embodied the belief that not only were they on this place, but their whole identity and their whole being was actually so connected to this place. And they looked at life as a co-creative act. The world was seen as being in constant motion and flux, everything being animate and imbued with spirit, consisting of energy waves and a myriad of interrelationships. Philosophically, they would be in total agreement with quantum mechanics, where the participant has an influence on, quote, what happens in reality. And there's also a radical biological theory called biocentrism, which really says, I co-create. And so all of these stories are re-emerging again in science. And the indigenous people knew this because they knew they had a participative role in shaping the cosmos. It was innate to their whole sense of self, to their identity, to being a human being. Today, our ceremonial acts are built on these core beliefs. It's believed that human beings are complete and whole only insofar as we realize that we are earth, air, water, and fire. We are earth. The earth is an unfolding story in which we participate. We know that we are of the earth, the same flesh, the same voice, the same thrumming rhythms felt within our hearts and spoken within our dreams, revealing the expanse of our wishes and imaginings. We are the fabric of the earth. We are air. We cannot live without it. Air resides within us and is as much a part of our lives and our bodies as any tissue or organ. We share air with every living creature. Metabolic transformations are continually taking place when we breathe in oxygen, nitrogen, and then an unusual argon gas, which is 1% of the gas we take in, and it comes in and it comes right back out, circles the globe all over and over and over again. And who knows, we may be breathing the same air as JFK my mother who passed. And when I go for a walk, I think of her and I go, yes, I'm breathing you in, Mother. And so I know that I feel her, not only feel her, but I know that she's there in many ways physically with me. We are water. Water begets life. Our physical being is composed of mostly water, and we are alive because of water. Our bodies are composed of approximately 70% water. Water embodies the Earth's vascular systems like the rivers, oceans, and lakes. We shape and give bodily form to the waters within us. And I love this. We provide a way for water molecules to talk to one another when we take in water. And it's so beautiful. So we're actually in some way in a reciprocal relationship with water. So not only do we benefit from water, but we give back by allowing water, because it's so alive, our water molecules to talk to each other. And the other element is fire. We need fire. Fire gives light and warmth to the body and spirit. One semester, about 7 years ago, 3 of my students from our tribal college died within the same semester. This was devastating to me as their teacher. In the pitch dark of night, friends and family sat around a spirit fire. When mourning the passage of a relative or a friend, a spirit fire comforts us. It slowly burns away our sorrows. The dancing flames shifting the shadows within us, retaining a numinous connection to those who have passed. My hope is that land acknowledgement is the beginning of a new story. We must co-create a more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Charles Eisenstein, one of my favorite authors, wrote a book entitled A More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. And he states, quote, when our beliefs change, so do our motivations and perceptions. We can begin to embrace new scientific paradigms that affirm the understanding that the universe is intelligent, purposive, and whole. A kind of magic does happen when a person undergoes a profound change in worldview. When our beliefs change, so do our motivations and perceptions. We do new things and see new opportunities, unquote. I end with a poem by N. Scott Momaday entitled The Earth. Once in his lifetime, a man ought to concentrate his mind upon the remembered earth, I believe. He ought to give himself up to a particular landscape in his experience, to look at it from as many angles as he can, to wonder about it, to dwell upon it. He ought to imagine that he touches it with his hands at every season and listens to the sounds that are made upon it. He ought to imagine the creatures there and all the faintest motions of the wind. He ought to recollect the glare of noon and all the colors of dawn and dusk. For we are held by more than the force of gravity to the earth. It is the entity from which we are sprung, and that into which we are dissolved in time. The blood of the whole human race is invested in it. We are moored there, rooted, surely, as deeply as the ancient redwoods and bristlecones.
Thank you, Nia. We have a few minutes left. John, is it okay if we take a few questions? I think we have a little time. Is that okay? Dennis, did you want to say anything about Nia's or?
No, I just appreciate her philosophical approach, certainly. And it is true, from my perspective, that all Native cultures, their spirituality emanates from their place. So I really thank you, Mia, for adding that perspective to this discussion.
I'd like to thank you, Nia, for that contribution and framing the question in a broader context of where we need to go hand in hand relationship with each other and with the earth. And thank you, Chief Coker, for reminding us that these are not empty words, but connected to actions. And thank you so much, Tom, for starting us on the road. I know you too will want to be talking about the state historical preservation folks as well. But this does leave us a few moments for questions. Lena, have any appeared in the chat?
So we've had a couple, but just to make clear the process for everyone, because there are so many of us and because we have some intermittent sound and technological difficulties, for the sake of our recording, we're really asking that you submit your questions in the chat to me, and then I will read them aloud so that Tom or Dennis or Nia or whomever is led from our speakers tonight can respond. This will also give me the chance to potentially synthesize similar questions if we have a number of questions around the same topic. And I know that many of you have submitted questions throughout this evening, but if you want to take a moment and just reflect on any questions that have risen in you and send those to me, I can start sharing them.
And before we, I cut off my video. And before we go, or people want to start leaving early, I want to remind people that we'll be back on Thursday night and we'll be talking about the 7 next steps to take. Thank you, Dennis, for reminding us and everybody that there have to be action items with a land acknowledgement, that's the purpose. Most places here in Tennessee have stopped. You know, they put the sign up on the wall or they put the plaque up on the inside of the door and they say, this is the land acknowledgement. They read it off and that's where it stops. But there are at least 7 more steps that we hope that, or I hope that people will take and that we'll talk on about them on Thursday.
Thank you for that, Tom. A lot of questions have come into the chat about those action items. So grateful that we'll be exploring that more on Thursday. And grateful to for this invitation that we've just covered the first step today. There's 7 more steps. There's a question here from Rachel saying, I think the who benefits question is good to ask oneself before any time that one is about to make a verbal land acknowledgement. I think there's a real temptation of ego in some circumstances, and I'll editorialize ego, but also distancing from the quote unquote bad history that perhaps I will speak for myself, my people benefited from, which I have to wrestle with. Rachel goes on to say, is the person doing the acknowledgement the only one who benefits? I cringe to think of the white person who steps forward to outdo other white people, as well as others, to prove that they're not one of the bad people. I don't know if any of our speakers would like to respond to this reflection or comment.
I think what it does actually is it really, that particular question, worrying about what people are going to think about how you say or how you phrase something, it really shows the frame of reference that we use in the Western culture. It's one of competition. And so actually my ultimate hope is, because we know that we are in a climate crisis, my ultimate hope is that through land acknowledgement, I mean, we can face history, and that is painful enough. And as Native people, we have to face our history in order for us to heal from the ancestral trauma, and that's what we are doing. But I would hope that the ultimate journey brings us to the realization that we cannot not look at the Turtle Island, if you will, or the living earth as a living entity and integral to who we are as human beings, because we are the triangulation of mind, body, and spirit. And the very essence, the spirit of the earth, is really integral to who we are as human beings. And my ultimate goal, really, always in speaking out, is really to bring us back to the center of who we are, to the, as N. Scott Mabede, who's Kiowa, says, we started from there, we're going to go back there. And acknowledging that the continuity of our essence is really contained in the earth, it's contained in the universe. And I think once we, especially as Quakers, I think that you've got a perfect infrastructure to say, I'm going to listen to the spirit, and the spirit speaks to each of us and saying, okay, this is my time to really hear what is being said. And it's not only unique to the indigenous people who heard the living earth and spoke to the trees and animals and so on. It's really part of what we need to do to heal as human beings. And the earth is manifesting our imbalance. And so the more we come back to that realization that we have to anchor ourselves within relationship with the earth, the human and the other than human world, then we're going to come to a real healing, I think.
Thank you, Nia. I will try to post the questions in the chat so we can sit with them. This one comes from Carolyn. In terms of using an acknowledgement and this fourth step you mentioned, Tom, of connect and confirm with First Nations, nothing about us without us, how do you recommend identifying those elders who have the authority to speak on behalf of the people who are currently living on the land or lived there before? Now I'll put this in the chat as well.
The easiest answer is to pass this off to Dennis as a chief.
Well, I do have a couple of views on that particular question, Tom. But in the East here, there are only a few communities that are left to carry the torch of the Native spirit. Most have left. They are residing on reservations from my perspective, the Lenape perspective, in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Ontario, Canada. But there are, a couple of groups in our area, speaking for those that are seeking to learn about the Lenape people who existed before the European contacts. And I would urge you to reach out. Those groups are, online. Their contact information is available. And I think you'll find them very eager to assist you in the work that you're trying to do. I would hope so anyway. So, that information can be difficult. Now, I will caution you that there are groups out there who pretend to represent, cultures that may or may not be official or validated groups. We are a state recognized tribe, as are the other two communities that exist in our region. So, our states, our respective states have really worked with us, done a lot of research on us. I mean, it took me 25 years of advocating for my community to get the state of Delaware to step up to the plate and say, yeah, I guess you're right. And it's amazing what happened after that, because prior to that, we were given very little credibility for anything just because we didn't have the white man's blessing, but after that fact, the phone just never hasn't stopped ringing, So, we have to be kind of careful, and I would urge you to find recognized communities in your areas, because there is conflict that does exist in Indian country even today amongst Indian groups. So, it's not an easy task, that's for sure. But I think with a little due diligence, you can find the right people to talk to.
I'll add something. Here in Tennessee, we had, back in the 1990s, we had no federally recognized tribes in the state. And 6 groups that I call culture clubs applied to the state for recognition. And one of them went so far as to put all their information together and send it away to the Bureau of Recognition with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And they found out that, and you can read this in John Echo Hawk's letter, response back to the Central Band of Cherokee in Tennessee, Lawrenceburg. And it is that not one of them had any native blood whatsoever. All 6 groups were white groups formed to essentially make money or make prestige, validate themselves as natives, and they were hoping to use the state to validate themselves even further. So that is, as Dennis was saying, that's one of the big concerns. You have to, well, I don't want to say you have to worry about it, but what I have found is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and the speakers of the nation are good people. When when tribes, I think it was like 15 different tribes, came down to Chattanooga to talk about Moccasin Bend, they were Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, who are the people essentially supposedly most knowledgeable about their tribal history. And then the speakers like Wilbur Gouge, older man, had traveled back and forth, was reprimanded by his elders for coming back east. It is, when we went up to meet people in Cherokee as good, to be considered good cultural speakers, we trusted some of the activists. There was an activist who had been doing it for 5 years on the women's issues side of things. She had been going out to Sundance in Dakotas to improve her spirituality, and it was her connection with the land, with the women, that led us to talk to several of the elders who were the best people to talk to. I'll have to say that I'm not always happy with tribal politicians. But somebody who's been there 25 years and elected time after time, that's a good voucher.
Yeah, it's been my experience with reservations that if you call the tribal council secretary and ask for the tribal historian, that will be a really nice contact for you, because Turtle Mountain, we have a tribal historian, very well known. He's written a couple of books. And the tribal secretary of the tribal council knows everybody because she's always there. And then also on Rocky Boy, we have a tribal historian. And it's usually not just one person, but the tribal historian will begin as your major contact, and then you can blossom out from there. And what I like about that approach, and that's why the question was so excellent, Carolyn, is really it's the beginning of relationship. You know, so for example, I'm not Crow, I'm Cree, so I can go down the road here 40 miles, and it's easy for me to physically go there and just go and talk. I know they have a big festival here next weekend, so I may go, and but if I really wanted to do business with them, I would call the tribal council and say, route me to the tribal, because the tribal secretary is more than likely going to answer, and then just ask her, what's the best way to proceed to get to understand and get to know the tribal history. And I think that's a really, really good start. And the beauty of what Tom was saying is that no one, and Dennis, is that no one voice actually reflects the whole of the entire history of the people. Everyone is going to sort of shade it with their own opinion, but that's all part of gathering data, don't you think? You know, it's like when you read a textbook in history. So for example, if you read the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, that's an entirely different perspective than some other history textbook you would use. You see what I'm saying? And so the more that you experience and hear the different voices all related to a common issue, the more likely you are to have a more complete picture of what's going on. But I find the tribal secretary, no matter where I'm calling, if I'm calling a tribal college, give me the secretary, the executive secretary, and then you're in, because she knows everything about that place. And same with the tribal secretary.
Lena, I don't know whether we have more questions. I suspect that we do. We did advertise that we were going to end at 9. I think other people would, yes, we would like to call this an end for the evening, as other people may have commitments and they may not want to miss anything. So if you have questions that were not answered, they will be shared with tonight's speakers, who will all return on Thursday night at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, when I hope we will all reconvene. We've given you a flavor that it is both complicated and that it is a commitment to a process to really do a land acknowledgement that is going to be both meaningful in its presentation and meaningful to both those who make the acknowledgement and to those whose land has been stolen also will benefit from our actions. Furthermore, we as Quakers believe in starting from truth and recognizing our history. It's got to be fundamental to starting the healing process that we all agree is so essential for all of us and for the earth. So I'd like to thank Tom and Nia and Chief Coker for being with us and helping us to understand better how to proceed and beginning the process that will continue tomorrow and into the future. I mean, on Thursday and then into the future. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Wanishita.
Wanishi.
took